Hello everyone, my name is Mahesh Mulye. I'm a lead product developer with solution engineering and architect team, SEAL team over here. The topic for today is BHCO migrating to 22.x on-premise or SaaS Helix platform. So the agenda for today is I'll be covering the migration process, which includes the overview of the migration process, followed by planning for the migration, followed by execution of the migration, followed by validation of the migration after the migration is complete. The use case, as I just said, is ability to help customers migrate from TSCO 2002 to BHCO 22.x on-premise or SaaS platform. So to get into the migration process, let's spend few minutes to understand the migration process overview. Migration process overview primarily consists of three main phases. The first phase is the planning phase, wherein primarily we do the assessment of the existing environment, how the customers use the product, out of the box features, as well as in terms of the use cases, as well as in terms of the customizations. The next phase is the execution phase, wherein we do the design in terms of mapping the existing use cases to the target platform, which is BHCO platform use cases, as well as this phase also involves actually executing the migration. The last phase is the validation phase, wherein after the migration is completed, we do validation of the use cases. So as I go along, I will go into each of these phases in more detail. To continue with the earlier slide, just to get into more details in terms of overview, when we do there are essentially, as you can see on the screen, right, there are essentially 5 steps involved in the entire migration. So the first step is always you plan and prepare for the migration, which means we understand the customer use cases, their integrations, their customizations, how his data is flowing from one place to another place. So we get into the details of existing customer environment, which also includes getting into all the customizations, how all the use cases are working. Once we do this particular step in terms of understanding the existing environment, we get all these details from the customer, and then we do the assessment. Then the next step is, after the assessment is done, we get an idea in terms of the customer environment. The step 2 is the design, which means there's a mapping done to to fit the existing use cases into the new architecture, BHCO AD platform architecture. And in that process, services might also be involved in the process. After the design is done in terms of making sure all the workflows are designed properly, the third step is actually implementing those changes, which may means implementing the customizations as where they're in TSCO, in BHCO, as well as step 3 also means actually migrating the data or the artifacts or entities relationships from the TSCO to BHCO. The fourth step is, after the data is migrated, after making sure all the customizations are also there in the BHCO platform, the fourth step is about validation, which means we validate all the use cases. And then the fifth step is actually the delivery happens. And when we deliver, as you can see on the right hand side, the deliverables are typically making sure all the infrastructure and business service visibility is there as it was there in TSCO. All the analysis modeling use cases are working as expected, along with the reporting use cases. In BHCO, as you know, there is a Grafana, which is a modern reporting tool. So making sure all the reporting use cases are also taken care of. So so the end goal of the migration is, after the validation, is all the use cases are delivered and they are working as expected. Now let's get into the detail of the 3 steps that I was mentioning earlier. So the first step is obviously the planning. So primarily what we do in the planning is we do the assessment of the existing customer environment. We understand all the data sources, all the integrations, how the data is ingested in the existing TSCO environment. We also understand all the customizations, custom views or reports, as well as the buffer table usage. So we get a holistic idea of all the use cases of the customer, and then we get all this data and we do the assessment. After we do the assessment, we come up with the, with sort of an assessment report, which tells us how the use cases will be mapped to the new architecture, as well as we also get an idea in terms of what it takes to migrate, what is the complexity of the assessment. And then we also suggest some best practices, like how the use cases can be handled in the new environment. As a result of that, if there are any gaps with respect to moving to the new architecture, we identify those gaps and we discuss those with the customer and we prioritize those. And finally, we take them up with R&D and PM. So this is the overall, I would say, migration assessment overview. So if I have to get into the details of what it really is involved in the assessment process, the most important piece of assessment process is we ask the customer to export all the custom views that they're using. So once we get all the custom views that they're using, we have a mechanism called the assessment tool, migration assessment tool. So we run that assessment tool against all the custom views that customer is using. So that gives us a report. That report ultimately tells us what are the data marts from this custom views that can be automatically migrated with a summary data mart that is far more enhanced in the latest version of BHCO, as well as what are the use cases which may need some redesign. So this ultimately allows us to get an idea in terms of complexity of the migration. Also, when we get into the details of the use cases that need redesign, we also suggest alternative workflows that can be used. And finally, so after going through all these details, we identify if there are any gaps that when the customer is going to be moved to the BHCO platform, we identify if there are any gaps, and then we discuss those with customer, and then we prioritize those, and ultimately we go back to the R&D as well as with PMs, and then tell them those gaps. Also, these things are also discussed with the customer to help them, finalize on the important pieces that are must for the migration. So we also discuss the priority with the customer. So that's the overall, I would say, assessment piece, which is an important piece. So one part of the assessment is the custom views, and then the next thing is we also ask customer different questions around what are the custom reports that they are using, if at all they are using. Are there any self ETLs which connect to the TSCO DB extractor? Are there any custom ETLs? So we get an idea in terms of overall the usage of the product. And then that way we also recommend the alternative workflows that can be used in the new architecture. For example, in the new architecture, you have a modern workflow of Grafana tool, which is used for the reporting purposes. So we also suggest the alternative workflows in different areas. And then if there are any gaps, we discuss them with R&D and PMs. The other part is we also get the sizing report from the customer. This is specifically more useful if customer is moving to the on-premise platform. So this helps to understand what will be the target environment size. So we also get the sizing report from the customer, so to get an idea in terms of how large the existing TSCO environment is. As part of the planning phase, when the migration happens from TSCO to BHCO, both the environments are up and running in that particular phase. So if there are any customizations, okay, that need to be developed and tested, the migration project could take some time depending on the number and complexity of the customizations. So since both the TSCO as well as BHCO are up and running, the existing VMs that were used as ETL engines on the TSCO environment, that cannot be used on the BHCO environment for remote ETL engine purposes, which means during the migration process, customer may have to set up some remote ETL engines on the BHCO environment that will do the job of collecting data from the on-prem environment. So even though the BHCO is maybe in a SaaS environment, the remote ETL engines will be hosted in an on-prem environment for collecting the data from on-prem environment. So there may be a need to have additional VMs during the migration project. So once the migration project is completed, then the TSCO VMs can be reclaimed. So this slide is talking about setting up some additional VMs during the before we start the migration. We have to plan for and then make sure the additional VMs are provisioned, which can be used for installing the remote ETL engines that will connect to the BHCO environment. So there are different approaches that are there to migrate. So these approaches are typically dependent on what are the customer use cases or what is the customer need. There are two primarily approaches when we consider the migration. The first is TSCO production to BSCO production migration. So in this particular approach, we set up the TSCO, we set up the BSCO prod environment, and then we migrate from the TSCO production environment. So in this particular case, the ETLs are running parallelly during the migration project. And then they are collecting data from the TSCO environment, as well as they are collecting data from the BSCO environment. So the advantage of this approach is you are collecting daily data not only in the TSCO environment but also in the BSCO environment, and then that can be used for any validations and these purposes. The only thing that happens in this particular thing is since both the ETLs are running on both the environments, we will be collecting data from the two sources at the same time. So one thing that can be done to manage this situation is on the TSCO side, ETLs can be scheduled at a different time in a day, and then on the BHCO side, the ETLs can be scheduled at a different time in a day. So let's say that on TSCO, you are collecting data from your some environment at 7 a.m. in the morning. So on BHCO, the same ETL can be probably executed at maybe 3 p.m. So this way, we can ensure that even though the same data sources are hit during the migration project, they are not hit at the same time. So this is one approach. Another approach is TSCO production to BSCO dev migration, and then later you do prod to prod migration. So this approach will make sense only if there is no TSCO development to BSCO dev migration involved. So mainly you are using TSCO development environment for testing purpose. So what we do in this particular thing is we set up the BSCO development environment, and then we do the migration from TSCO production to BSCO dev migration. So in this case, we validate whether all the data is migrated and not, and then we can also set a few ETLs just from the customization testing perspective, and then once everything is validated, then only we can do the prod to prod migration. So in this case, obviously, since we are doing the prod to prod migration at a later point in time, towards the end of the migration project, in this case, the ETLs will be executed on both the environments, and they will be hitting the same data source for a smaller amount of time. So those are the two approaches that we recommend when we migrate the customers from TSCO to BSCO. The next phase of the migration is execution. So when we consider the execution, there are, I would say there are primarily 4 categories wherein we can categorize the content that is migrated. The first category is the content that is automatically migrated from TSCO to BSCO, that falls into the automatable category. The second category is the manual category, wherein some content, like for example, data marts and buffer tables, those are not automatically migrated, and there is some manual effort that is required, when we migrate from TSCO to BSCO. The third category is no migration at this point in time, but in future releases, there'll be more features, or I would say support would be added to take care of those use cases. Okay. So that is the third category, which is no migration today. And then the fourth category is no migration possible. So this primarily involves some of the features which customers were not using, so they were discontinued, also because there were alternative workflows available. So those are the 4 categories that we have, or the 4 different categories we can consider when we migrate the content from TSCO to BSCO. So this slide is talking about the migration workflow. So in terms of migration workflow, as I was explaining before, both the TSCO 2002 as well as BSCO 22.x environment are up and running. as well as the second prerequisite of the migration is make sure that the remote ETL engine for BHCO environment is configured in the on-prem environment. So those are the two prerequisites. So just to recap, for first prerequisite is make sure TSCO and BHCO are up and running. And then the second prerequisite is make sure the BHCO remote ETL engine is installed in the on-premise environment that connects to the BHCO 20.x environment. So once these prerequisites are made, the migration workflow execution begins with downloading the toolkit from the BHCO 22.x downloads page. And then we have to configure the configuration file called application properties. We populate that with the tenant ID as well as with the access key and secret key, which are needed to execute the migration. After that, we run the migration toolkit. After the migration toolkit is run, what happens is it creates a tar file, and then that tar file is transferred onto the from the TSCO environment to the BHCO environment. After the tar file is transferred onto the BHCO environment, it creates a system task that takes care of populating the BHCO environment from the tar file. It populates all the configurations, all the entities, relationships, all the analysis model, which means all the artifacts. Also, it includes tags and ETL configurations. So all this data is populated from the tar file that gets transferred. So this process may take a day or two, or maybe less than that, depends on the size of the environment. After this step is complete, the next step that also happens automatically is the data migrator ETL tasks are configured on the remote ETL engine, on this particular remote ETL engine. And then those data migrator ETL tasks take care of migrating the historical performance data as well as the configuration data up to last 2 years. So that data is transferred from the TSCO environment to the BHCO environment. So this transferring the data may take couple of weeks depending on the size of your environment. So after the data migrator ETL tasks are finished, you should have all the performance data in your environment up to last 2 years. So this is the slide that is covering the entire migration workflow. The next thing, as I briefly touched upon in earlier slides, is what are the different categories in which the content is migrated, or I would say not migrated. So the first category is the automatable category, wherein the content that is already there in the TSCO gets automatically migrated to the BHCO environment. So this involves all the entities, relationships, all the tags, configuration data, performance data, all the entity time filters, then all the tags, all the artifacts, analysis models and reports, as well as all the events and everything. If you have any summary data marts, those are also automatically migrated. So this is something, there is nothing to be done if the content gets automatically migrated. The next bucket is the manual bucket. So this bucket means there is a redesign involved to migrate the content from TSCO to BHCO. So as I explained briefly earlier, this may involve having the services on board to take care of any customizations that you may have to map those to the BHCO AD platform environment. So if you have any data marts that are using public views, that would be actually can be migrated in most of the cases using summary data marts, and in some cases it may need some redesign. If there are any other use cases like buffer tables or advanced reports we're using, we have to make sure that those are redesigned properly on the BHCO ADA platform. So this is a second category, which is a manual category when we think in terms of migration. The third category is no migration, which means because there were some alternative workflows available or features were not that used by the customers. So there are some features that are discontinued, as you can see on the third bucket. And then some of the other features are planned for the future releases. So those are the three, I would say, categories in which the migration content falls into these different categories. The last step of the migration process is a validation. So validation, so when we consider the validation, there are actually different considerations that come into play. So So there are four, I would say, when the migration project is completed, there are different things that need to be validated on the target BHCO environment. So there are entities that need to be validated. Make sure all the entities that were their relationship certified, that were there on the TSCO environment, make sure those are there on the target BHCO environment. So that is the first thing. The next thing is all the integrations, which means whatever data that were getting ingested in the TSCO environment, or whatever performance data was there for the last 2 years, make sure all that data is migrated in the BHCO environment, as well as all the workflows integrations, they work as expected. So that is a second, I would say, point in terms of validating the migration. The third point is about use cases. So we ensure that all the use cases in terms of infrastructure or business service visibility, or in terms of analysis, modeling, reports, or views, they are working as expected. So that is the third point of the validation. And then we also, the fourth point is about workflows. So we ensure that end-to-end workflows are working as expected. So this also includes any customizations. So we ensure, so in short, this slide is talking about the importance of validation and what all is involved as part of the validation process. So whatever I just explained, this slide is just explaining some more details, technical aspects of it. So once we actually execute the migration, as I explained, the tar file is transferred, and then the system task is configured on the BHCO environment. So that system task actually does the job of populating the BHCO environment with all the entities, relationships, tags, analysis models, all artifacts. So after this task is finished, as I said, it may take a day or two. We have to validate that all these things are there, correctly represented as they were in the TSCO environment. Make sure they are also represented correctly on the BHCO environment. After this step is complete, the data migrator ETL tasks are scheduled on the remote ETL engine. So as part of the validation, we have to make sure that those are running properly. There are no errors. So data at a time we populate data for 7 days, and we go in the past up to 2 years in the past. So as and when those tasks are running, we need to ensure that the data is really getting populated into the BHCO environment. So we could validate the configuration performance data as it is getting populated into the BHCO environment. So those are the technical aspects of validating when the migration is getting executed. Apart from that, as I just to re-emphasize the importance of it, if there are any customizations as they are developed, we need to ensure that they're tested periodically. And at the end of the migration project, we need to ensure that all the use cases are working as expected. So they need to be validated end to end. So this slide is talking about some of the references that can be, you have access to these references, whether it's a homepage of BHCO 22.x documentation, as well as the other references giving you the homepage for the migration process. So it goes into different details. So you can definitely go to these pages and then get more information from this reference documentation. So just to recap, today we covered the migration process overview, as well as we got into the details of what it takes to migrate in terms of planning, executing the migration, finally validating the migration, and then we also looked at some of the references that would be useful for the migration. So this is a YouTube channel for our BHCO environment. So thank you very much for attending today's session.